The courtroom's echo was sharp that morning in Washington, D.C. Every footstep carried like a hammer strike against the marble floors. Every whisper rebounded as though the building itself refused to let words vanish. Outside, the wide steps of the Justice Department were suffocating beneath. A crowd of reporters, their cameras mounted like rifles waiting for the first movement of prey. Satellite vans lined Constitution Avenue, their dishes pointed skyward, ready to beam every second of drama to millions around the world. This was no ordinary gathering. For weeks, newspapers, late-night talk shows, and political podcasts had been fixated on one question. Would a young African president dare to defy the very machinery of Western justice in its own capital? Inside, the Justice Department's marble halls seemed to hum with tension. Chandeliers gleamed above polished columns, their golden light creating both grandeur and intimidation. The setting itself was designed to project permanence, as though justice here were carved into stone, immune to challenge. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, former prosecutor, sharp, polished, and utterly aware of the power she commanded. She wore a pristine white suit that seemed to glow under the hall's golden light. Her pearl necklace was perfectly aligned, her blonde hair immaculately styled. Every detail of her appearance had been calibrated to project authority, superiority, and inevitability. She was not here to defend a position. She was here to assert ownership of the conversation. A faint smirk curved her lips, the kind of smirk that suggested she already knew the outcome and merely waited for the world to catch up. And then came the counterweight. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, walked with deliberate, measured steps across the polished floor. Unlike the army of advisors, aides, and lawyers that usually accompanied a head of state in such settings, he arrived alone. His presence did not need an entourage. It drew every eye regardless. Dressed in a dark tailored suit with a subtle line of traditional embroidery stitched into the collar, he carried himself with the calm of a man used to storms. His gaze was steady, his movements unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. For many in that room, it was the first time they had seen him in person. They had read the headlines, seen the images of him saluting troops or addressing his nation in fatigues. But this was different. Here, in the marble heart of America's legal empire, he was not a distant African leader. He was a man standing on their ground, prepared to speak in his own voice. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture every twitch of expression, every subtle gesture. For them, this was more than politics. It was theater, and the actors were stepping into position. Pam tilted her head as their eyes finally met, narrowing her gaze with a practiced air of condescension. Her smirk deepened, the corners of her lips tightening with just enough disdain to remind him, and the cameras, that this was her arena. "Mr. Traoré," she began, her voice smooth, polished, dripping with the confidence of years spent dismantling opponents in courtrooms. "Without us, there's no justice." The words floated into the silence like a knife. Reporters perked up, pens scratching faster. A few typed the quote directly into live blogs. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She was planting the headline. The soundbite that would circle the globe before the session had even properly begun. Traoré's eyes didn't waver. He let the silence stretch, refusing to dance to her tempo. The pause was deliberate, heavy, uncomfortable enough that several journalists glanced up from their notes to see if he would falter. Instead, his voice came low, steady, but carrying the force of something that could not be rehearsed. "Then justice," he said, "was never yours." 7 words. That was all. But those 7 words struck the room like a tremor. A muffled gasp came from somewhere in the back row. One reporter chuckled under his breath, not because it was humorous, but because it was devastating in its precision. In that single line, Traoré had not merely rebutted her claim, he had dismantled the premise she stood upon. Pam's smirk faltered for the briefest of heartbeats, a micro-expression caught instantly by the cameras zooming in. But she recovered quickly, leaning forward as though pressing her advantage. "Careful, Mr. President," she said, her tone sharp, her words clipped with prosecutorial bite. "You're in my arena now." Traoré's reply was almost a whisper, but it carried. "And yet," he said, "I'm still standing." The stage was set. This would not be a polite exchange of diplomatic niceties. This would not be another dull panel where talking points collided and nothing changed. This was going to be a public reckoning, and neither intended to back down. Within minutes, the clash was trending. Reporters had rushed to upload the video snippets, and hashtags began to flood timelines. Hashtag Justice was never yours. Hashtag Travis Bondi, and in Ouagadougou. A swelling tide of posts under hashtag Our Justice. Commentators split instantly into camps. Some praised Pam for her cold reminder that American systems set the rules. Others celebrated Traoré's defiance, calling it a long overdue challenge to the arrogance of Western legal dominance. Inside the Justice Department's grand hearing room, the first official session was called to order. Rows of delegates, representatives, and observers filled the chamber. Flags of dozens of nations stood behind them. Colorful symbols of diversity that only partially disguised the imbalances of power in the room. This wasn't a trial in the conventional sense. No jury box, no criminal charges. It was an international justice forum. A high-stakes debate on the future of global legal cooperation. The United States had invited leaders from across the world, but the narrative had already narrowed. This was Bondi versus Traoré. Pam spoke first, rising with the confidence of a woman who had made a career out of courtroom dominance. She wielded statistics like weapons, citing agreements, past interventions, international treaties, our legal frameworks, she said, her voice carrying the smooth cadence of practiced rhetoric, are what keep nations from descending into chaos. Without them, justice is just an idea, fragile, fleeting, and ultimately meaningless. She paused, glancing at Traoré with a faint sneer. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment. It was as if she dared him to disagree, dared him to step into her web. When it was his turn, Traoré did not reach for papers or notes. He had none. Instead, he stood, resting both hands lightly on the podium, his gaze sweeping across the assembly. Justice, he began, his voice slow, deliberate, is not a gift handed down from powerful nations. It is the right of every people, born from their culture, their struggles, and their laws. To claim otherwise is to confuse authority with righteousness. The shift in the room was visible. Delegates from Africa, Asia, Latin America, those who had long lived beneath the shadow of stronger nations, leaned forward. A few exchanged knowing glances, subtle nods. The air thickened with something more dangerous than disagreement, recognition. Traoré's words did not stop. They came measured, steady, each sentence landing like a hammer against the edifice Pam sought to defend. You say, without you there is no justice. Yet when my people were under foreign control, you called it law. When resources were taken without consent, you called it order. And when we demanded fairness, you called it unrest. The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, vibrating with the shock of hearing truths long whispered now, spoken in the very halls that once dismissed them. Pam's jaw tightened. She leaned forward again, voice edged with steel. Mr. Traoré, it is easy to speak in ideals, but without enforcement, without the power of established courts and oversight, your so-called justice is just words. You need structure. You need us. The phrase, you need us, rippled through the chamber like a cold wind. Delegates from smaller nations shifted uncomfortably. It was a sentiment they had heard before, sometimes wrapped in diplomatic language, sometimes not. Sovereignty had always come with an asterisk. Traoré inhaled slowly. His voice sharpened. You speak as though justice is a brand. You own, as though verdicts only matter if they bear your stamp. But tell me. He leaned forward slightly, his tone cutting. When your own system fails your people, who judges you? A murmur spread through the room. Pam's polished confidence flickered. She countered quickly. We hold ourselves accountable. That's the difference between us and unstable governments. Accountability, Traoré replied, is not a press release, Miss Bondi. It is action. It is leaders stepping down when they betray their people. Laws applied equally to rich and poor. Can you say your system does this? Or is justice in your hands simply a tool to keep power where it already is? The words hit like a blow. Cameras zoomed in on Pam's face. capturing the micro-expressions she could not hide. In the back row, African Union delegates exchanged subtle glances of approval. The duel was no longer subtle. It was open. Pam straightened, her smile tight, her voice adopting the cadence of cross-examination. Mr. Traoré, you speak about principles as though they can run a nation. But how long will your people respect these so-called homegrown laws when criminals go unpunished because you lack the reach and resources of our institutions? Her insinuation was clear, without Western oversight. Burkina Faso's justice system was doomed to collapse. A few American delegates nodded in agreement. But Traoré's expression did not shift. His voice was calm, almost disarmingly so. Respect is not bought with surveillance drones and imported judges. Respect is earned. When a child in the most remote village knows, the law will protect her as much as it protects the child of a minister. Pam crossed her arms, her smirk returning. That sounds poetic, Mr. President. But reality isn't poetry. Reality is power. We enforce the rules, and the world is safer for it. Traoré stepped forward, closing the distance. His voice dropped lower, carrying a weight that silenced the murmur of side conversations. Safer for who? He asked. For those writing the rules, or for those forced to follow them without a voice? You call it justice. I call it obedience. The remark landed like thunder. Delegates from smaller nations straightened in their seats. Some nodded quietly, others whispered to neighbors. Even the moderator froze, realizing this was no longer a debate on theory. It was an assault on the very legitimacy of a worldview. Pam's tone sharpened, almost desperate to recover control. Without structure, without our partnerships, chaos wins. You cannot build justice in isolation. Traoré's reply was instant. His eyes locked on hers. Then perhaps, he said, it is time the world learned that justice doesn't need permission to exist. The chamber erupted into murmurs. Some supportive, others unsettled. Cameras captured every twitch of Pam's jaw, every flicker of fire in Traoré's eyes. The duel had only begun. The hours after the capital confrontation unfolded like a storm that refused to pass. The marble atrium that had once echoed with gasps and hurried whispers was now a battlefield of narratives, each one colliding with the other in a chaos of microphones, headlines, and digital feeds. America had witnessed something raw, something that could not be polished by spin doctors in a back room. The system had been challenged, and it had been done in the very house that symbolized its permanence. Pam Bondi retreated into a cluster of aides, her face still wearing that composure, crafted over decades of television appearances and courtroom battles. Yet beneath the gloss, the tremor in her hand as she reached for a glass of water betrayed the fracture. She had faced cross-examination before, prosecutors, even political adversaries, but this was different. She had been ambushed not by a rival lawyer or politician, but by a narrative embodied in a man from Burkina Faso, a soldier who had dared to speak truths in a chamber addicted to lies. Ibrahim Traoré, however, had not retreated. He stood in the corridor where reporters pressed closer, their recorders and cameras flashing like an ocean of fireflies. His uniform, a stark contrast to the polished suits around him, looked almost like a relic from another time, a reminder that authority could be earned in mud and blood, not merely in marble offices and campaign donations. His voice, steady as stone, carried above the fray. Do not mistake silence for defeat, he told a journalist who shouted if he feared deportation. I spoke because it was necessary. You call it disrespect, I call it honesty. If America cannot face its reflection, then what is left of your democracy? The question cut deeper than any prepared statement from Washington's political class. Social media exploded within minutes. Hashtags like #TraoréTruth and #Capital Confrontation trended worldwide. One commentator wrote, "It takes an outsider to remind us what freedom of speech is supposed to mean." Another countered, "A foreign officer lecturing Congress? Disgraceful. He should be removed immediately." The White House, predictably, scrambled. Behind closed doors, advisors debated whether ignoring the moment would starve it of oxygen or whether silence would be seen as weakness. Some whispered that Traoré's words resonated too much with the disillusioned youth of America, with those who already doubted the morality of their institutions. Suppress him too forcefully, and he would become a martyr. Allow him to speak freely, and he risked becoming a symbol. Pam Bondi, in her private suite, replayed the footage. The cameras had captured everything: the tightening of her jaw, the forced smile, the slip in her rhythm. She was used to wielding control like a weapon. But in that instant, she had been made vulnerable. Her aides tried to reassure her. The public will side with you. He's foreign. He embarrassed himself. But she wasn't convinced. Bondi had always understood one brutal truth: politics wasn't about truth, it was about perception. And the perception now spreading across the internet was damning. She looked not like the confident prosecutor of her career, but like an emissary of a system exposed. Meanwhile, Traoré's presence in Washington became more than a spectacle. Universities invited him to speak, though security concerns blocked most appearances. Student groups chanted his name on campuses. Veterans wrote open letters, some praising his courage, others condemning him for disrespecting allies. In one cafe near Georgetown, two young journalists whispered while scrolling through clips of the confrontation. "He's not just criticizing foreign policy," one said, leaning in. "He's calling out the rot in the system itself. That's why they're scared." "But he's not American. Why should anyone here care?" The other replied, "Because truth doesn't need a passport." The words echoed like prophecy. In the Senate chamber the next day, the debate spilled into the record. Some members demanded an apology from Traoré and the African delegation. Others argued that silencing him would validate his accusations. One senator from Vermont rose, his voice sharp. "Are we so fragile that we cannot withstand criticism? If democracy means anything, it means listening, even when it burns." But for every voice defending the principle, another rose in anger. The fault lines were not just about a Burkinabe soldier, they were about America's own reflection, about whether the system could still absorb truth without shattering. Pam Bondi prepared for round two. She requested another appearance, this time televised on prime networks, where she could reframe the narrative. Her team wrote lines laced with patriotism, with appeals to security, with warnings of foreign interference. But Traoré anticipated it. In a rare late-night interview with an independent journalist, he said, "Watch carefully. Tomorrow they will not defend their policies, they will defend themselves. That is the difference between leadership and survival. One seeks the future, the other clings to power." When the sun rose over Washington the next day, the stage was set. The capital had survived protests, debates, scandals, but rarely had it felt this fragile. The clash between a seasoned American insider and a defiant African outsider was no longer just a headline. It was becoming a test of the system's ability to withstand truth itself. And as the crowd gathered again, with cameras primed and security doubled, everyone knew one thing: whatever happened next would not fade quietly into history. It would ignite. The night air outside the Capitol was heavy with humidity, clinging to the skin like a second garment. Washington streets pulsed with a nervous energy. Police barricades still lined avenues, where earlier protesters had clashed with riot shields, their chants echoing into the night. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights slicing through the darkness like accusatory eyes. Inside the Senate chamber, the confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Pam Bondi had become more than an argument. It had turned into a spectacle, broadcast across every major news network, dissected in real time on social media platforms where millions of viewers debated, mocked, praised, and condemned. Bondi, ever composed, leaned forward, her manicured hands clasped tightly together, as if in prayer or preparation. "General Traoré," she said, her voice carrying over the tension, "you've had your performance. But nations aren't governed by raw passion. They're governed by law, by structure, by continuity. What you call hypocrisy, I call the cost of stability." Traoré, unflinching, met her words with a stare that was both accusatory and unyielding. His voice rose again, gravelly, unwavering. "Stability for whom? For the farmer whose land is seized to feed a corporation? For the mother whose child dies because medicine is priced higher than her life? Or stability for men in polished suits who trade suffering for profit?" A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some senators looked away, uneasy, while others scribbled notes furiously. The press gallery above was alive with movement. Reporters whispered urgently into headsets, knowing every second of this exchange would headline the morning cycle. Bondi shifted tactics, her tone sharp but calculated. You speak as though corruption is a Western invention. Look closer to home, General. Coups, repression, censorship. Your own continent is rife with it. Are we to believe that you are somehow different? That your revolution is immune to the rot that has infected so many before you? Traoré inhaled deeply, the weight of history pressing upon him. His next words were not merely a rebuttal. They carried the cadence of generations silenced before him. I do not claim purity. I claim struggle. We do not pretend to be perfect, but we do not hide our flaws behind think tanks and trade deals. When Africa bleeds, the world looks away, unless it is to plunder. When Africa rises, you call it a threat. What you fear is not corruption in Africa. What you fear is Africa free. The chamber fell into stunned silence. For a moment, even Bondi faltered. She adjusted her papers, though everyone knew she no longer needed them. The real battle had shifted from the Senate floor to the millions watching online. The media war. Screens across the globe lit up with hashtags. Hashtag Traoré Truth. Hashtag Bondiviestre. Hashtag Capital Clash. On TikTok, clips of Traoré's fiery declarations went viral, spliced with subtitles and set against beats of revolutionary music. On Twitter, pundits debated in 280 characters whether he was a demagogue or a prophet. CNN's panel called it the most electric confrontation on Capitol soil since McCarthy's hearings. Fox News labeled him a radical strongman exploiting Western guilt. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, crowds gathered around radios and televisions, erupting in chants of solidarity every time his name was mentioned. The clash had become bigger than the two individuals. It was no longer just Traoré versus Bondi. It was the global South versus the global North. History versus empire, memory versus denial. Behind closed doors, away from the cameras, in corridors lined with mahogany and marble, senators whispered among themselves. Some feared that giving Traoré a platform had backfired. Others admired his candor, even as they disagreed. Bondi, in a private corner with her aides, recalibrated. Her eyes, steely and calculating, betrayed no sign of defeat. Let them have their moment, she murmured to an assistant. Tomorrow, we'll remind the public what he really represents: chaos. They'll cheer tonight, but when markets tremble, people always run back to order. Yet even she knew something had shifted. The old narrative, that Western order was the inevitable endpoint of civilization, had been cracked. The final exchange. Back in the chamber, the moderator, desperate to maintain order, offered each a closing statement. Bondi rose, her voice clear, persuasive, almost maternal. Ladies and gentlemen, America stands not for perfection, but for progress. We are flawed, yes, but we are also a beacon, a partner, a system that, despite its imperfections, has lifted billions out of despair. Do not let fiery rhetoric blind you to the truth. Without structure, without law, without the checks and balances of our institutions, the alternative is not freedom. It is anarchy. The chamber applauded, polite and restrained. Then Traoré stood, his military posture unbroken, his voice carrying the weight of storms. You speak of anarchy as though it were our creation, but we live every day with the anarchy of hunger, of bombs dropped on villages in the name of peace, of debts that chain us to poverty. If this is your order, we reject it. If this is your progress, we refuse it. The world is no longer yours to dictate. We are not your subjects. We are not your resources. We are not your shadows. The words hung in the air like thunder. The silence afterward was heavier than applause. The aftermath. When the session adjourned, Bondi walked briskly out, her aides surrounding her like armor. Cameras swarmed, microphones thrust forward. But she offered only a tight smile and a carefully rehearsed line: America will always defend order. Traoré, on the other hand, lingered. He walked slowly down the marble steps of the Capitol into the humid night, greeted not by officials but by the chants of protesters, who had waited hours outside. They surged forward, chanting his name, raising fists. waving signs that read, "Another world is possible." For the first time in decades, the steps of the Capitol did not echo with American triumphalism but with the cry of defiance from a continent long silenced. Epilogue: The world reacts. In Paris, commentators debated whether France's grip on its former colonies was collapsing. In Beijing, state media praised Traoré as a voice of resistance against Western hypocrisy. In Lagos, musicians began recording songs sampling his speeches. Pam Bondi returned to her legal career, booked instantly on cable news as the face of American resilience. Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso, where crowds greeted him not as a mere leader but as a symbol, a man who had gone to the very heart of empire and spoken without fear. And in the digital ether, in the countless screens where people replayed his words, a question lingered. Had the world just witnessed the first crack in the edifice of Western dominance? Only time would tell. But the night Washington trembled, history remembered the voice that refused silence.